My name is Geoffrey von Oeyen. I studied architecture at Harvard GSD. Before then, I was at Cambridge University doing a Fulbright in the history and philosophy of architecture. And I did my undergraduate in urban studies at Stanford University. And so that was my background, kind of my educational background. And then I worked for Frank Gehry for almost 7 years. Worked on about a dozen projects, and then worked primarily on the Fondation Louis Vuitton in Paris, and then also a few years on the UTS School of Business in Sydney, Australia. So I did that, and then founded a practice, Geoffrey von Oeyen Design and von Oeyen Architects in Los Angeles after Frank Gehry, and I've been also teaching at USC School of Architecture. So my father is an architect, so that was the connection for me. And I think that since I was a little boy, I was very connected to architecture. The first place that I lived as a kid was Lafayette Park in Detroit by Mies van der Rohe. So I lived in a townhouse by Mies and lived there till I was about 3. And that had a really profound impact on me, just the sense of living in this landscaped park, the steel glass details, the feel of the space, the reflections, the transparency, those things had a big impact on me very young. I ended up living, later on, the family moved to Thousand Oaks, California, and then I lived in an Eichler house by Quincy Jones, and that had an impact on me. Like also another modern house, but one that was made for, lots of families, this sort of idealized single-family home, mid-century modern home that was also affordable. They're much less affordable now, but at the time they were affordable houses for families. And then my father designed the house that I grew up in Malibu, California, in western Malibu. And so I remember that process of the construction and being on the job site and seeing him working. That had a really profound impact on me. When I was a student, I was the first class of my high school, in Malibu High School, at startup. And the principal was a graduate of Stanford University. And he was my history teacher as well. And he really promoted Stanford and thought it would be a good place for me because I was interested in the arts and sciences. I had a very diverse set of interests at the time, and a lot of work in history. I was doing a lot of theater, a lot of drama work and acting. And I also loved sports, and I swam and played water polo. I was a sailor, and I ended up sailing at Stanford, and I ended up acting at Stanford and building sets and designing sets. And I got interested in urban studies, and I focused a lot on how cities are developed. Focused on all of the forces that go into making urban conditions, and it really opened my eyes to new places. I studied abroad in Europe. I was at Oxford when I was an undergraduate, and I studied the history of campus planning in architecture. I had a wonderful mentor at Stanford, Paul Turner, who worked with me on Le Corbusier and Frank Lloyd Wright and Mies van der Rohe and these kind of canonical modern masters. He was really an expert, especially in Le Corbusier. He helped to found the archive, which is now the foundation in Paris. So before there was an actual foundation, he was writing his dissertation on the education of Le Corbusier. And so he did this amazing thesis where he helped unpack the boxes of books from Corb's studio and was, organizing them and working there. And he wrote a dissertation about the education, the early childhood education of Corbusier, because he had all his books that he had from his childhood and teenage years and early 20s, and kind of looked through those and tried to understand the formation of Le Corbusier. And so that was really wonderful to me. He taught me about architectural history, about research, and I did my undergraduate honors thesis with him on Chandigarh, which is sort of the end of Korb's career, and focused on the monuments in the Capitol complex. And I got a grant as an undergrad to go to India and stay in Chandigarh and study a lot of primary source documents there, and also at the Fondation Le Corbusier in Paris. And so I was able to do a lot of work, a lot of research on Korb, and that was my foundation really for architecture. That's how I got started and got into it. I feel related to a number of places. I think that the place that I feel most connected to probably is Malibu, California. And I think it was the place that was the most formative experience for me growing up. It was the place where I really fell in love with nature in a very deep, profound way. Hiking in the mountains, surfing, being in the ocean, and I did a lot of reading there as a teenager, as thinking about my first experiences with philosophy, first ideas about design and art and culture. So it was a place that very formative place for me, and also a place where I really developed an appreciation for daylight, an appreciation for view, an appreciation for a lot of the things that are critical to my work now. I think those experiences of living with light, natural conditions were very, very profound to me. I think Le Corbusier is someone that I never met but felt the closest to, in the sense that I spent so much time with his sketchbooks and so much time with the primary source material, reading, looking through these things that I really, I think I learned from Paul Turner this way to reverse engineer where he was thinking, how these buildings came to be. I wanted to find all of this, the trace of the sketches, and go back and back and back and step back into where was the concept idea, how did that evolve, the evolution of it. Was extremely profound to me. I think Mies van der Rohe is another architect that has been very important to me, just in the sense of having lived there in Detroit and experienced that. It was an architect I revisited in my thesis when I was at Harvard. And I did my thesis on redeveloping one of the blocks of Lafayette Park that never got developed the way Mies wanted. So I did a 21st century version of the Lafayette Park. And I focused on that with a lot of the personal knowledge of Mies, but then I did a lot of research in Mies as well, and that was important. But, you know, the formation that I had besides Paul in Le Corbusier, Peter Carl was my advisor at Cambridge University for my MPhil, and Dalibor Vesely. They taught me about phenomenology. They taught me about the relationship between philosophy and architecture. Taught me how to situate objects in the world. I mean, when I was at the GSD, I had a series of just remarkable mentors. From Toshiko Mori was my advisor. Jorge Silvetti was an advisor of mine, and I had studios with just these remarkable studio instructors, with Ron Whitty, and with folks who just, I think, had a big influence on the way I considered the design of architecture. The most important of whom for me was Preston Scott Cohen. He was my thesis advisor. I'd had him for descriptive geometry in my first year, and I've always enjoyed geometry, and I fell in love with the process working with Scott, thinking about how geometry related to architecture, how I could incorporate that spatial thinking between the orthographic and three-dimensional work. later on, after that, of course, Frank Gehry was a major influence. I spent a lot of time working with Frank, and his partners such as Edwin Chan, design partner. My time at Gehry Partners was very meaningful because Frank was also a sailor like me, and we connected in that way. So we would go sailing on the weekends together, and he wanted to buy a boat, and I helped him to pick out this boat, which was just this great experience for me because I was in Paris, and he sent me to the Paris boat show to go look at some boats, and I connected with a wonderful French boat dealer in Los Angeles, and we went on a race together to Mexico, down to Cabo San Lucas, and we picked out this boat that Frank wanted to sail on it. And I have just wonderful memories of, not only was Frank generous to let me race this boat with an office sailing team on the weekdays, on the Wednesdays, but on the weekends we would sail together, and Sunday afternoons. And I learned so much, conversations with him about architecture, the things he was thinking about when he wasn't at the office, and things that he was imagining. And that was a profound experience for me, is a mentorship. I think it's important that my job, both in the university and in professional practice, is education. I spend a lot of time with clients trying to educate them about the role of the architect and the value of the architect and what actually happens. I think there's a lot of misinformation about what architects do, about the role of design, or what role design has in culture, what impact it could have, not only on an individual project, but on an urban condition, on a civic condition. So I think there's a lot of education that needs to happen. And that part I take very seriously, and I find that that's a larger and larger part of my job. With students, with clients, with community leaders. I was the president of the LA Forum for Architecture and Urban Design for in 2018. And in that time I realized so much of our mission was about, which was neither a university institution, nor was it a private practice. It was a totally independent nonprofit organization, but it was about educating largely the general public, as well as folks in discipline with us, about the value of design, and to provoke a conversation about the value of design in our culture. And I think it's, to your question about whether it's difficult to be an architect in the United States versus to be an architect in, I don't want to compare to somewhere else, because I can speak for my experience of being in the United States. But sure, there are really big corporations that are, it's easy for them to get work in certain ways also, but they're also, they have to take a certain kind of work, or they have to process the jobs on a certain timetable, or they have to move in ways that they're less nimble. They are less able to move outside of their comfort in some way to do the work. Kind of larger corporate firms, they have to operate in a certain way. I have a lot of flexibility. That's a good thing and a bad thing. I have flexibility to arrange the structure of the projects, to arrange the structure of the relationships, the structure of the contractual format. And not that those firms don't, but they have certain pro formas that are really important that they meet, not just for their, say, one office, but multiple offices around the country, and the metrics by which they're, compared. I have a flexibility in that I'm not responsible for meeting those demands, so I have less parameters placed on the operation, that I can have. I think that's true for lots of smaller firms, but I also do think that it's true that the level of service and the kind of professionalism of architecture is becoming very, very important to clients. And there's a level of ease and service and a lack of mystery that folks want. Folks want lots of clarity and lots of checking the boxes and making sure that the communication is clear on all of these ways that I think the larger firms are very good at performing. But it's frankly no different than the way culture is moving towards large firms like an Amazon or something, where we look for fulfillment. We expect this kind of high level of service anywhere we go. I want to order this thing, and I know it's going to come, and I can track it, and I have all this accountability, and I have these systems in place. I think it's very similar what clients are demanding in the world of architecture. There's more of that. There's less about I'm going to hire this person, and it's going to go into some mysterious artistic process, and I'm going to get this back. No, a lot of clients, they like that. They want to have that dialogue. They want to have that process, but I think they also want the clarity. They want increasingly. And that's harder to compete, harder to produce those infrastructures. But at the same time, there's so much open source information, so many various digital platforms to facilitate communication and organization that it does make it easier. But I think that in general, I'm very optimistic. I feel it's an exciting time to do architecture. I think it's an important time. And I think especially if you talk about the United States, we're having such a problem right now with housing. And it's such a crisis because we've had so much resistance in our culture to building new housing and to keeping the market value of housing up at such a high level, to the exclusion of so many people. So many people denied housing or don't have access to housing. Folks in Los Angeles area driving 3 or 4 hours to get to their jobs, when we have the capacity to realize housing for them. We have the capacity to solve these urban problems in relation to transportation, housing, community, and I think that, to me at least, I think that more and more members of the general public who are not involved in design, not involved in urbanism or architecture, are becoming more aware of those things. And that's exciting to me because I think they see the relationship between good design, good architecture, good urban design as important for the health of the community. I think schools are being asked to broaden the expectation of what the training of a young architect should be. So, I think traditionally there's been a lot of emphasis on the disciplinary technique, so the representation, drawing, modeling. How do we push that? How do we work on professional issues, issues of practice, or how to coordinate work with other disciplines, engineers, government organizations, that sort of thing. And there's clearly now a strong interest in civic values, social justice in architecture as well. There's a strong interest in thinking about how do we use these tools, how do we use this expertise, how do we utilize a design education to be a citizen architect, as our Milton Curry, our dean, talks about. I think that these are all important for folks to understand, and it makes it harder to train to be an architect. Now, there's so much information that you are meant to be accountable to. I think that the idea of the disciplinary learning always has to be there. The ideas of design and composition. So if you talk about doing, let's say, gallery installations or pavilions or something like that, I think there'll always be a place for that work in what we do, because like musical composition, there's always going to be something about the composition of the music, and regardless of how it's used or what it does, you have to know how to use the notes or paint or any type of art. You must know how to work within that discipline. And I think that as we expand the field of architecture to broader issues, and frankly issues that have been in architecture about society, all of early modernism was about addressing these larger social needs of housing and maybe income inequality in some ways, but clearly very blind to issues of race and gender, ethnicity, and colonialism and things like that we're now able to process in a more responsible and thoughtful and empathetic way. And I think that those are all issues that we must take into account. I don't think it doesn't, by focusing on social issues or social justice or any ways that architecture can participate in urbanism in a meaningful way, I don't think that that's an excuse for any type of poor design. And I think that is where students have to understand that when you're building in any kind of civic condition, you are responsible as a fiduciary not just to your client but to the general public, and how people experience the city, how they experience space and improve the lives of folks who are forced to live with whatever is going to be built there. That becomes their sculpture, that becomes their neighborhood, that becomes the way they interact, the spaces they interact, and how they visualize their homes, how they visualize the places they care about, where their families interact, how their business is conducted, etc. We within the discipline of architecture are responsible for making sure that the students that we're educating and the work that we produce is of a very high quality, very high design quality, but it's not, we cannot just allow ourselves to simply be tools to the values of others. And I think that's the important message, is we have the ability to design well, we have the ability to realize these things, but we have to also be participants in the conversation about how those design ideas are applied. So for me, that's very important to communicate to students, and also in my conversations with clients and thinking about the work that I do, thinking about how to communicate my values within the context of a situation where they may think the architect is just going to make this thing look good, make their idea look good, make something that is beautiful or exciting for them in some way, but really doesn't touch values or is inert to values or something like that, where I'm saying we should have a conversation about those values. We should figure out why this thing is here and what it can produce in terms of a civic outcome that's better than the initial idea of what that thing was meant to do. Can it do other things? How many other things can it do to promote civic discourse and inclusion, empathy among people? How can you make something that makes people feel inspired about the place they are and promotes a kind of society that is better for everyone? And it sounds utopian, or it sounds Pollyannish in some way to say it like that, but I do think it's true. I think that we have an obligation. We're not simply neutral observers or simply the realization of the ideas of others. We're not tools. Like many of us, I'm splitting my time between the teaching and the practice. So I've got two lives, dual lives going on, plus my family and my young boys. So I'm very busy with all of these things, and I love how the practice and the teaching can play off each other in a really positive way. I'm doing so this right now, teaching graduate thesis. So we're working on the relationship between composites in architecture, so new materials, looking at how you can apply techniques from other disciplines to create housing using prefabricated techniques, super light, super strong, multi-unit organizations. So using those to figure public space, to figure shared space, and it's kind of grayscale from public to private. So sort of Noli plan transformed into a grayscale map of which places are very private in housing to which ones are shared by a few neighbors, through semi-public to public spaces, all sort of within a private development, thinking about how housing can offer value to communities in that way. And formally, how through the creation of these modules and these interchangeable parts, like toys, like really flexible aggregation systems can figure space. And so how that the figuration of that space occurs is the focus of the project right now. So very focused on that. This term in particular, we'll be finishing up in a couple months, and then I'm also teaching a seminar related to that, and I'm teaching also a professional practice course for students who are foreign nationals who are studying in the United States and working in the United States, helping to mentor them in their professional internship experience. I'm also working on the committee where we're doing communications and events, so all the lectures, symposia, events for next year. I'm the chair of that committee, so we're working through all of that. In my professional practice, I've got several projects under construction right now, so several houses, a commercial project in just outside of Atlanta, Georgia, which has been, the interiors have been finished up. The core and shell is done, so finishing the interiors on that. I'm working on some new projects in Central Coast of California, in Chicago, working on some adaptation of some existing mid-century modern towers, and in China also doing some work now on the some new civic project in China, which has been a little slower this last month with the coronavirus. I just traveled there before the travel was stopped, but I'm very excited to keep pushing on that because it's I love China. I really wanted to get back into academia. So I had done, as I mentioned, my undergraduate, and then right away I got a Fulbright to look at the history and philosophy of architecture. And then right after I finished history and philosophy of architecture, I transitioned immediately into the professional practice in MArch education. And from there, well, it was an academic experience. It led me directly to working. I was hired to work at Gary Partners before I graduated from the GSD, so I went immediately to work. And you know, in that time period, I thought I really want to get back to academia. I want to get back to ideas. So the first experience teaching, I had two experiences of teaching right away. One was with Edwin Chan, who was the partner at Gary's office, and he invited me to teach a studio with him at Berkeley right away. As soon as I left the office, I started a studio with him and up at Cal Berkeley, graduate studio. So I was traveling there, and I also in that same term was starting to teach at USC. And so I was teaching in the undergraduate program at USC and the grad program at Berkeley, and doing both and flying back and forth, all while I was trying to start the practice up. And my second son was born, I think at the time of our final reviews for both of that. It was a very busy first semester, like a very busy time, first quarter, first semester. And then I settled down. I said, I've got to stay in one place. So I said, okay, I'm going to teach at USC. And I really enjoyed at USC I think you talked earlier about the idea of a well-rounded education, the idea that you're going to have the ability to approach design, approach practice, approach other disciplines, landscape, urbanism, heritage conservation. And I think the way that being situated in a research university too has been a wonderful opportunity for me. Right now I'm collaborating with the Viterbi School of Engineering to work with their experts in carbon fiber and new materials. So actually working with folks who have designed aircrafts and built aircrafts for their whole career and working with their technologies. So that's been very positive thing for me. But that's how it was a deliberate thing to get into it. And sometimes it feels like drinking from the fire hose where I want to do it, and then there's more and the more, and I just, and I love it. But it's busy with the practice. It's a lot of work, and but as long as I have the energy and I'm enjoying, I want to do it as long as I can. So I think the hardest thing for me in the past was this last year. I designed a house for my brother, and it took about 5 years of permitting and planning out in western Malibu, near a place where I grew up with, and he had found this old ranch house, and it was this beautiful site, just gorgeous view, and a very good time to buy and sort of put everything into this project to make it happen. And we got it built, and really just after it was completed, the Woolsey fire came through California, and it burned all of that area of Southern California, Malibu and part of Ventura County, that area, and it destroyed the house. I was there for the evacuation. I tried to stay there, and there were no fire department or anything like that at the time. Everyone was overwhelmed, and it was just walls of fire coming through the neighborhood. And we stayed until the bitter end, and finally had to leave because there was just walls of fire coming to the house. And I in looking back at that experience, and the house being lost, that was a 5-year investment, design and focus and blood, sweat, and tears to get anything right, to detail something, to work through the process, and to invest that much love and care and attention to something, and then see it destroyed. That was a hard thing for me, and it was. I think, we all have losses in our life, and there was no person who was lost. There was no. It wasn't a family member or anything like that. So I feel very fortunate in that sense. But that idea of, as creative people, when you invest so much into some effort, that ability to also to let go of that was hard. It's been a remarkable life lesson to say, I'm going to do something in my life where I invest everything. Time or resources, any kind of focus that you can give to something, all of the love and attention, and know that it may not be there, it may not happen. We feel these things in architecture all the time. If you do a competition and you lose, or a project that you've worked on ultimately doesn't get realized, or things like that. In this case, very difficult to actually see it through and see it realized and then see it destroyed. It was, if you've lost a file or, a 3D model or something, you feel a little piece of that, but I never felt anything quite like this. It makes me think about wanting to pursue things with more vigor and more heart, and to put myself out there and do the work and say, I don't know what the outcome is. I can't control what the outcome is going to be at the end, but I know that I can control my participation and my enthusiasm and my passion. I can bring that regardless. But it's hard to kind of do that. You learn that as a parent as well. I think that you don't really know how your children are going to develop as their own people. They're their own people, but you can put everything into shepherding them through that process of being a kid, and kind of find out at the end, they're their own person. And not having that control, I think that's been a huge lesson for me in the fire. And I would love to be able to do more of that. I guess so in the future, I think that I would like to be more courageous about putting myself out there, even things that are very personal, things that I feel should be in one category and not another, or this seems more academic, or this is more professional, or this feels more appropriate for this, etc. To kind of say, look, this is if the ideas are there and the opportunity is present to realize this thing, I'd like to have the courage to put that out, regardless of the outcome. And even if it's a terrible failure, or even if it's doesn't happen, I feel like after the fire, what's the worst that can happen? I could lose a commission, or someone could, write something unflattering about it, or it doesn't happen, or it, it could burn down, but I've been there. So, there's really not a whole lot worse that could happen. So that gives you a sense of confidence as well, to kind of go to the bottom and say, okay, I've been there, I've pounded my fists on the ground and I've cried it out, and now I'm in the place where, all right, that's where it goes. That's where it's as bad as it is, and gives me a sense of strangely a sense of optimism, not so afraid, not as tentative in that regard.